Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us clarity of thought and clear definitions as we approach this discussion. We left off last week with a few comments on the Golden Age, and you know, I'm not going to discount the wonderful things that happened during that time, and I think that would be foolish to do, but to assume that this is the result of Al Islam, I think is a mistake. Um, it seems to me to be a bag of mixed fruit, if you will, both good and evil. And I know that's not what the prophet intended. And if you pay careful attention to divine ordering of things according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's overall scheme, especially for us, because He clearly makes it evident in Al Quran and throughout history that there are consequences if we don't follow the scheme, if we don't follow the plan, if we fall into a path of behavior and habits of behavior that take us away from the way. See, and um, one of the things that happened at the very beginning, and it's pretty evident that although there's some controversy over the corruption that entered Al Torat in the 8th century before Isa, that it's pretty evident that Adam fell away. And not only did he fall away, but he was also commanded, as Iblis was commanded, to get ye down from here. Now, getting ye down from here, that's a metaphysical imagination that has overtones of all sorts of figurative meanings. And I don't want to get involved in that right now, but it's the idea, the archetype of falling away from the path that I'm on here. And why did he fall away? What did he slip into error? He slipped into an error. And Christians consider this to be this error to have been the result of um, disobedience, and that disobedience was then passed on to all of his descendants, and Adam, not just representing one individual in the minds of many theologians, but representing an entire species, if you will. You know, we can call that species Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, wise man or wiser man, if you will. I don't know. I'm not going to profess to be to know these things, but I'm bringing them up as a matter of an overview here, so that some we and our listeners can be on the same page. What did Adam do? Adam ate fruit. He ingested. He took into himself ideas that caused him to produce both good and bad fruit. And that's what I'm getting here. He ate from that tree. And that tree is representative of a seed. If you want to reduce the tree to its fundamental essence, you have a seed. And that seed is planted, it becomes a tree, it bears fruit. And this fruit was called uh, the fruit of the tree of good and evil. Okay, so what we have here is benefit and harm, but this is not just any harm that we're talking about. We're talking about when it says evil, we're talking about um, intentional harm, you see. Now, it's one thing to ascribe intentional harm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and but you can't call that evil because it's Allah's plan, you see, and the consequences that are related to that are narrated in the Quran involve the innocent and the guilty. You see, when certain consequences fall. So this is pretty evident to anyone who reads the Quran carefully. So, but Allah is not. We cannot describe evil to Allah. It's part of the plan, and we cannot describe evil to Allah Himself because Allah is not part of creation. Allah created creation. You see, so creation contains this evil in it, and this evil is part and parcel of what is supposed to motivate us towards righteous behavior, and that's also in the Quran. The Quran makes that very clear. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to paraphrase so many archetypal theological positions here. So then what are we left with here with respect to Adam? Because Adam is separate, you see, from our source creator. Adam is a creation. He's a created being. And he then ate from this tree of this source of the seed that produces good and evil. And then that seed became part of him. He passed it on to his generations that followed him, his posterity, which includes all of us, according to the Quran. And this caused a separation, you see, from the, how shall we say, to the ideal, caused a separation. It affected our relationship, our ideal relationship with our source creator. And so we don't know what that ideal relationship really is because, we haven't had it. If we follow the linear, you see, narrative, you and I, we don't know this thing. We have maybe a small idea, an inkling, if you will, of what that ideal relationship was before Adam's slipping away. And the difference being that between Adam and then the creature we call Kabil, you see, is that Adam repented and Allah set in motion then a way of return, you see, to this ideal relationship. So that's what we're all striving for, at least those of us who admit our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're trying to get back on that path, stay on that path, and produce only the good fruit. Okay. So what I am referring to here with respect to the golden age is, hey, look, there's a lot of good fruit, but this is not the ideal. There was a lot of bad fruit there too, you see. And this bad fruit did not assure the clear direction of the way of return. So that's what I'm alluding to here when I bring this topic up, dear brother. And the reason I bring it up is I want to ask you, okay, and I want to pull out of you what it is that you know that can of this particular age that will reflect that corrupted seed, if you will, that's producing both good and evil. You see, because if we go back to Muhammad's time in Medina in particular, okay, Muhammad did not produce any evil, you see, during his lifetime and during the time of that particular Medina constitution. Everything that was the result of the constitution and was a consequence, all right, based on his relationship to an established order, an established confederacy, if you will, and we've discussed that before. So he's doing his utmost to keep him and his companions and those who have submitted to him on the way. And there was evidence, if we believe some of the narratives, okay, that there was a divine intervention. We look at the attack on Medina itself. That's clearly some sort of a divine intervention. And there's obvious stories like that throughout history. For you look at the Spanish Armada being destroyed off the southern coast of England, during Elizabeth's time, and you say, hey, well, that looks like that smacks of divine intervention to me, you see. And the Quran says as much. The Quran confirms that some natural disasters are divinely instigated, they're divinely ordered, and there is an intervention that occurs. Now, scientists, and especially atheists and non theists, would look at that and laugh at us, and well, so be it, let them laugh. But we're discussing an archetypal phenomena here, okay? And I'm comparing and trying to contrast this at the same time. What happened during the days of those few years of the Medina Constitution, and then what happened during the Golden Age? Are they the same? Okay, what's different about them? What constitutes evidence that this good and bad fruit were produced, you see, during that period? And the reason I'm bringing this up is whenever I've attended conferences concerning the Golden Age, and God knows how many there are, you see, um, I don't recall anyone talking about the bad fruit, you see. And it's as if it didn't exist. And everyone's just looking at the sheen of this wonderful facade called the Golden Age. So now, in view of that introduction, to my question here, um, we've discussed already, you see, the troubles that occurred previously with the rationalists being ignored and even murdered, mass murdered, if you will, in the past. And so that doesn't seem to be good fruit to me, you see. It certainly is intentional evil action causing the loss of lives of decent human beings who were just expressing a reasonable opinion, you see. So, and we see evidence of that to this day, you see, in groups like the Taliban and ISIS, and even the local biases in any community, you see, where Muslims gather in so-called submission to their divine ruler and still commit these terrible sins of bias and nepotism and covering over the evil. Now, I understand, we're not supposed to be marching down the street saying so and so committed such and such an act on such and such a day. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the organization, the political organization, if you will, and the application of a political will that ignores crime and averts justice, which is the inversion of what we're commanded to do. You see, so what can you tell us about the Golden Age that reflects any of this um, mixed fruit, that I'm discussing here and trying to focus in on? What is it about the Golden Age that allows people to look at the sheen and ignore the sin? Inshallah.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar. I just like to a brief footnote to what you said about the people who are laughing. I heard it said that the person who laughs last has the best laugh. So
Mm,
I wouldn't, be too depressed just because some people are laughing at us. But let me just begin by my
of course.
right. So, yeah, you put the question in a very interesting way because, yes, you are quite right. The golden age, as any age, even evil ages have something good that happens in them. During the Nazi rampage, we had people who were trying to fight against the Nazis and what have you, even though they were the dominant force for a time. So yes, every age has its can I say, good, bad, and the ugly, so to speak, or
Sure.
it's a mixed bag of things. So now, in terms of yes, we agree that the golden age of Islam was distinguished itself by these various scientific achievements, and also achieving a certain harmony, I would think, between reason and revelation. And perhaps there were some issues in trying to, integrate tradition into the body of knowledge of Islam. As we have seen, there were several groups competing with each other, and normally the analysis is placed or is approached with the dichotomy, as which I have also used, of a struggle between the so-called rationalists on the one hand and the traditionists on the other hand. The traditionists are represented by Al-Shafi and other followers of tradition, while the rationalists, now here it can become a little bit hairy, because actually they were altogether, they weren't just, the division into just the two groups is a bit of an oversimplification, because if you take a closer look at what was going on at the time, there was actually a third group.
Mm-hmm.
And a third group, which I don't think I mentioned in our last discussion, were the so-called Ahlil Kalam. Kalam here refers to the word of Allah. And they believed in following the book of Allah alone. They didn't believe in following the hadith. So you might say that Ahlil Kalam, the theologians or the Mutakallimun, as they are also referred to, by the way, they were the precursors of the Mu'tazilites, who were also against, they were not big fans of the hadith, and they also were fans of reason or rationalism. So now, what they had in common, the Mu'tazilites and the Mutakallimun, is that, okay, the Mutakallimun were the precursors of the Mu'tazilites, and they both upheld the primacy of the Quran and a very important role for reason. Now, the traditionists, on the other hand, argued that the revelation of the Quran, the Book of Allah, should be approached through the prism of tradition. In other words, that we should follow the interpretation of the Sahaba and our predecessors because they knew better than us.
Yes.
So in the process, they established this pecking order where, they are pretty much at the top of the pyramid, and us later epigons, perhaps you might say, are near the bottom of the pyramid. Okay, I'm overstating the case a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is that by emphasizing the importance of following the so-called, some people call it a priestly class, they have created, or we have these intermediaries now between us and Allah, the ulama, you see. And the traditional Muslims are fond of saying that there's no priestly class in Islam, but I'm not so sure whether this is the case. It may come under a different name. But to come back to the three groups that were competing, so to speak, for attention, there was also the third group was the philosophers, falsafa as they are sometimes known, and they would include people like Al-Kindi, Ibn Sina, and others. Now, the Ahlul Hadith were opposed to both of the other groups. They were opposed to the philosophers and falsafa. After all, Imam al-Ghazali issued a fatwa that they should be killed in his book, The Confusion or the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. So he was an Asharite scholar and was very strongly opposed to, them. And also we have statements by Ibn Hanbal, who was very much against, so-called philosophical speculation. So the science, but the whole issue is complicated a little bit by the fact that the division between what we call today natural science or empirical science and religious sciences was not as sharp back then as it is now. But what I'm trying to emphasize in these remarks is that when we look at who actually Al-Shafi was debating, it seems that his primary, the people that he was addressed were primarily the Mutakallimun, the Ahlil Kalam, which would then, if that is indeed the case, that would then perhaps give us justification to recast the whole discussion that we have previously placed in the context of the, debates between the rationalists on the one hand and the traditionists on the other hand. We could recast that, or if you like, upgrade perhaps that approach by saying that, well, it was also, if not more so, a discussion between the Ahlul Quran and Ahlul Hadith, you see. And one reason I say this is because I think I mentioned that I'm a frequent visitor on Clubhouse. We have a couple of clubs there. Edie Pupsel and I started one, and I have my own. And this comes up almost every day in every discussion that I participate in. We have the traditional Sunni brothers and sisters, and then we have the Quran-centric people, and they are always clashing over the relative role of these two sources of Islam. Now, my personal position is that I don't think we should reject the hadith wholesale, because after all, the hadiths are part of the Islamic legacy. We cannot
Yes.
deny it. I think the mistake that happened was how the hadiths were integrated into the body of knowledge, you see. And I think that if they had been integrated without making the traditions a foundation of Islamic legislation, without making it as something binding, then things would be okay. That we could still rely on a hadith, for example, to pick up bits and pieces of wisdom, hikmah here. There's one hadith says that the highest form of jihad is to speak truth to power. Now, who could disagree with that? We have people who have been doing it. This is a very risky, effort to tell the truth. But, in the old days, they used to have the court clown, who was the only person who could
Yes,
tell the
right.
truth in the presence of the king, because everybody would say, "Oh, he's just kidding. He doesn't mean that." So he could tell the truth and survive at the same time. Now, that doesn't
Yes.
always happen in other cases. So where I'm going with all this is that, yes, indeed, there was a seed of destruction, you might say, that were sown. Some seeds of the negative fruit were already sown during the Golden Age, and I would identify the seed that led to the negative developments later on in Islamic intellectual political history was this turn against, reason and rationality, but also a kind of prioritization of the hadith in relation to the Quran. Now, they go together, I think. After all, when you use your reason, what are you going to use your reason for? I mean, you can use it to study the Quran. You can also use it to authenticate hadith and what have you. But what I'm trying to say is that, and let me give you an example of what I mean by the seed of destruction. My feeling is that some problematic exegesis transpired already in the Golden Age. And what I'm referring to is the tafsir, or interpretation of the Quran, which led to the establishment of the so-called doctrine of jihad al-talab, the wars of expansion, which is exactly the opposite of what the Quran teaches. The Quran does not allow waging wars of territorial expansion and calling it fighting fi sabilillah and saying that what we are doing here is spreading Islam by the sword. No, that is not allowed. Yet somebody allowed it. It wasn't the Prophet, and certainly it is not in the Book of Allah. So it was some of the ulama, in fact, who basically claimed, on the basis of the appeal or recourse to the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword, these ulama actually have done what I would suggest is very problematic exegesis, because through the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword, they basically transformed Islam as a religion of peace into Islam as a religion of war. Now, that was a major catastrophe, I think, in exegesis, and it led eventually to the collapse of the Muslim empires, because the Muslims later on, yes, they scored some initial victories, we know that, but later on, because they embarked on so many of these wars of aggression, like, for example, Turkey attacked Vienna twice, and there were some other instances of aggressive warfare that were met by retaliation from the aggrieved parties. We even have examples. Iraq under Saddam Hussein attacked two countries. He was very seriously defeated. So we will never find a change in the Sunnah of Allah, as and we know from the Quran that Allah does not love aggressors, you see. So the bad tafsir that I'm referring to, apart from the doctrine of abrogation, is the misinterpretation of a key verse 193 in Surah Al-Baqarah, which ends with the clause that there shall be no hostility except against Zalimin. Now, the word zulm can mean darkness, wrongdoing. It has many meanings. It can mean oppression, aggression, injustice, fitna even. So now the the ulama who erred, I think, in my humble opinion, when they connected this verse to another verse in Surah Luqman, where Allah says that, oh, sorry, not Allah, but the fellow there who is talking to the Luqman says to the young man, avoid shirk because it is a shirk, it is a zulm azim, it is a great wrongdoing or great wrong. But the ulama took that phrase, and shirk, of course, is idolatry. So, and then they took that meaning to back to the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah and said, you see, because zulm is idolatry, we are still justified to wage war against the people who are idolaters, you see. Now, but that is a problematic conclusion, because if you look at the verse carefully, 193 Surah Al-Baqarah, doesn't say that you will fight this, the people that you can. There shall be no hostility. The verse uses the Arabic word udwan, which udwan means hostility. Now, enmity can take different forms. It doesn't always have to take only the form of fighting, you see. So Muslims are allowed by the Quran to, remain less than friendly, let's put it that way, to the idolaters, but they have no right to attack the idolaters unless they are attacked first by the idolaters, you see.
Yes, yes.
So this bad tafsir, to put it briefly and directly, gave the Muslims the impression that they have this obligation to go and fight against non-Muslims just because they are not Muslims. And this interpretation was taken up, or misinterpretation, I should say, was taken up by people like, Maududi and Said Qutb. And I have to also perhaps make a correction or a partial, caveat on what I said last time. It seems that Ibn Taymiyyah did not wholeheartedly endorse Jihad al-Talab. According to an Egyptian scholar, his name is Abu Zahra, who is quoted in another book on apostasy written by the former Chief Justice of Pakistan, S.A. Rahman. Abu Zahra points out that the three of the four major Sunni scholars, all except Shafi'i, did not support the doctrine of the jihad al-talab, or aggressive war, but Shafi definitely did. And Abu Zahra concludes by saying that Ibn Taymiyyah himself preferred the position of those three, Sunni scholars who did not endorse wars of aggression, unlike Shafi did, for example. So I just like to mention that as a point of clarification. However, to add just one more comment on Ibn Taymiyyah, there are some other passages that you will find in his writing where he definitely sounds like he does support, spreading Islam through, the sword. Like, for example, he called for the extermination of the Mongol rulers who converted to Islam, but he considered them to be hypocrites, and therefore they should be killed. So his argument was, because they are not ruling according to the Sharia, they are causing zulm, this injustice, and therefore we are, allowed or permitted or even required to kill them or to fight them. So now this was, a problematic conclusion, because the Quran makes it clear that even the Prophet himself, who did not know who were the hypocrites among his people, yet here Ibn Taymiyyah claims to have knowledge that even the Prophet didn't have. So I find it very problematic. But
that
anyway,
is
to come back,
yes.
yeah. So just to conclude, what I'm trying to say is that the seeds of destruction of the Islamic empires were already sown when the Mufassirun misinterpreted key Quranic verses and basically reinterpreted Islam as the religion of peace, as a religion of war. So I'll just land my case there. Thank you.
I see. Well, that's an interesting observation, which on first hearing appears to be objective, and I use that term consciously, because what we appear to have is a group of subjective opinions vying for dominance, you see, and this dominance is what then is guiding the actions of the Ummah, under the direction of whatever throne is listening to these opinions and saying, yes, yes, okay, let's do that, yes. And while they're saying yes, there are some who are saying, this is in my favor, so we're going to go with it. Which leads me to another question, you see. And I and many others are wrestling with this. And this is at the core of all of these wars of opinion, if you will, the Hadith wars or whatever you have. Is there an objective approach then to reading Al Quran so that one can take the position of what you call this kalam group, or say, okay, well, we are the Quranists, and this is what the Quran objectively establishes. Now, the reason I'm bringing this challenge up, you see, is because the Arabic language that is used in the Quran is something that's new. Now, it's not that it didn't have precursors in the linguistic stream of speech, the development of speech and writing, but apparently, according to what I've heard from other scholars who are much more informed than I am, and I'm still trying to understand this whole thing as an outsider, if you will. The Arabic used in the Quran and the language used in the Quran, the symbols which are used to imaginatively inspire the ideas which are held within those concepts, is different than street Arabic or even many other linguistic approaches to the art of writing and the art of speech, the art of communication. So the Quran says, well, this is the finest language ever produced, or I'm paraphrasing again. That's why we have used this language. So, in your opinion, during this wonderful golden age that we have, you just established, well, yeah, some of this bad seed is still being sown into these wonderful fields of human endeavor, where everyone's trying to serve God, just like the Catholics and other Christians tried their best to serve God, and they still commit heinous crimes against themselves and against nature and against the God they profess to serve, because of some form of miscommunication. So my question is, well, is it possible to approach the language of the Quran in an objective fashion? And has anybody actually done it, you see? Because all of these different tafsirs, now you specifically mentioned this, there's a problem with the tafsirs. I think this is now becoming more and more open to admission, amongst those who look at these matters. Well, if there's a problem with the tafsirs from those ages and even up to the present age, well, something's wrong with the approach to this wonderfully perfected language and art of writing and art of comprehension. It seems to me that there must have been at one time people who understood it, you see, and they were prevented, or somehow this art did not reach us. Now, I'm mentioning that because not because I've established it from my own research. I've had others inform me. Well, this is apparently what happened. If you talk to someone like a brother instructor in Benjamin Bilal, he says, yes, there was a group of people who understood the imaginative language the way in which it was delivered to our prophet. And they had no conflict with each other here. It was very straightforward, very clear. And so were they eradicated, this group? Was that art lost? I mean, why are these people vying with each other, just like the Jews over their interpretation of the Mishnah and the Talmud, all during this time, as the same time as the development of what so-called Golden Age? The Jews were doing this under the protection of the Muslims, and they're taking the already misrepresented and corrupt uh, 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 Torah from the 8th century translations, and I'm sure that there's other versions as well that weren't so corrupt, but they were turning to their own traditions during this same time and under Muslim protection, and then investing these interpretations into the tafsirs and the various bodies of literature that we can call parascriptural literature in all three monotheistic faiths. You see, it seems that this influence is there. So, what happened to the purity of observation, which would give you an objective view of what the Quran is really saying? And was that amplified during this time of the Golden Age? I mean, it's confusing for us who are sitting at the outside. We don't have access to the literature, we don't have access to the language. In order to understand these things, you'd have to understand Persian, Aramaic, Arabic itself, the language of the Quran itself, which is a different form of Arabic, and whatever other Jewish Hebrew languages were used. I mean, we don't have access to all this knowledge which is sitting out there floating around amongst the academic circles. We have to rely on people like yourself to tell us what really happened. Why does this tafsir different from that tafsir, and why is and if the Quran is actually an objective representation of the actual Word of God, why can't these people see it and agree? What's going on here? Are they blinded? Is there some sort of bias which has been injected in them that prevents them from seeing what is actually there on the page to be seen? You see, because apparently the Quran is, except for these, additional periods and comma and other diacritic marks, it's pretty much the same as it was given at the very beginning to this day. So, these diacritical marks and the commas and the separation in the chapters and all that sort of thing, that's maybe something that's been implemented to help us better approach the Quran, but it's not how the Quran was given. And in the original manner in which the Quran was given, the people at the time, the contemporary companions and those of the immediate generation following them, they didn't seem to have this kind of difficulty with them. So I don't know how to ask this question. I mean, it's a complicated question, and I'm sure you've given it some thought, which is why I'm bringing it up. Like I said, I'm just trying to, pull it out of you. Yeah. What happened to this art of reading the Quran objectively? Inshallah.
Yeah, excellent question, brother. I would say, if you have time, have a look at chapter 6 in Muhammad Shahrur's book called Quran, Morality, and Critical Reason. He answers that question in considerable detail.
Is that
and
so?
The short answer, yes. The short answer is one word: politics. Politics corrupted the tafsir. Because the ulama were faced with rulers that wanted a reinterpretation of revelation that would enable them to wage wars of aggression and present these wars of aggression as spreading Islam by the sword. But the real objective of these wars of aggression was the accumulation of booty and territorial expansion. So some of the ulama were obliging, and they came up with the theory of abrogation to support the doctrine of the wars of aggression. And they also articulated a concept of the so-called conflict, clash of civilizations, if you like, an early Muslim Islamic, early version of it, the so-called clash between Darul Islam and Darul Harb. As you know, Samuel Huntington also wrote a book recently, The Clash of Civilization.
Yes.
Islam versus the rest. Well, the Darul Harb versus Darul Islam is pretty much, old wine in the same bottle, so to speak. So exegesis was compromised by political pressures. You see, they lost their independence, the ulama, the ones who supported the wars of aggression. And so their tafsir became unreliable. And as I argue in some my work also, much of the work of traditional ulama also was rendered unreliable by the fact, not only because of political pressure, but also because of the pressure to refrain from using reason in the interpretation. Now, if you are going to stop using your mind and then try to write the tafsir of the Quran, I don't think you are going to get very far. And that's exactly what happened. We have some serious distortions, in the interpretation of the Book of Allah. Let me give one more example here. There's a famous verse where a part of the Quran where Allah refers to the Muslims, the early Muslims, as the Ummatan Khairan, the best community. Why? Because they command what is good and discourage what is evil. Amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar is the Arabic term for it. Now, the ulama, what I call the militant ulama, have misinterpreted the meaning of the word nahi as prevent or prohibit, while in fact it means to discourage, you see. So you can discourage people from committing evil by admonishing them, but you cannot prevent people from committing evil in some cases except by using force. So by misinterpreting the meaning of nahi as prevention or prohibition or as tahrim, as Omar Ramay in his in his book called Muslims' Greatest Challenge between Islam and tradition, that he goes into this and he gives an excellent explanation of this. So this kind of playing around with the meaning of Arabic words is what I mean by problematic or bad tafsir that has really caused in the traditional rendition of what actually the Book of Allah teaches us. So that's just one example. So politics was a big factor behind the distortion of the message of the Book of Allah. Another example of this politicization of, in other words, exegesis was reduced to the rank of propaganda, and that is no longer academic discipline. It has been compromised. It has to be rebuilt, as Shahrur says, from bottom up, to make it consistent with the principles that the Quran itself teaches. For example, another factor that undermined traditional tafsir and jurisprudence, making assumptions about the Quran, which are completely contrary to what the Quran teaches. And I think I touched on this before, so I will be very brief about it. But basically, the traditional ulama assert, contrary to what the Quran, what the Book of Allah teaches, that the Quran contains verses which are unclear. B, that the Quran is. They also teach that the Quran is incomplete because it's missing details on how to pray, and that it is incoherent or contradictory. You see. So the philosophers were not alone in being accused of incoherence by Al-Ghazali. The ulama also accused Allah. Can you believe this?
Yes, right. Yes, okay.
And the audacity of such a claim, really the arrogance of such a claim is, I'm just gasping. I'm at a loss for words. Where did they get can I say use the word chutzpah to make such claims?
Chutzpah, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So these are some of the factors that really corrupted our knowledge of the teaching of the Book of Allah. And don't forget also the split between the Sunnis and the Shia. And each side was inventing hadiths to support their own political agenda and to justify their worldview of what actually happened. So I think the short answer is it was politics who basically, inability to resist political pressure that led the corruption of the mainstream. I mean, the what we perceive as the traditional, rendition of the teaching of the Book of Allah. Now, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of is objectivity possible, I remember when I was studying philosophy back at the University of Toronto, in one course, it was required reading to read. I don't know if you're familiar with Hans Georg Gadamer's book called Truth and Method. Now,
Mm-mm.
Hans Georg
No.
Gadamer was a German, sort of philosopher. The book was
Mm-hmm.
massive, 500
Oh
pages
my
or
God.
so. I
Yes.
managed to get through it. But what he
Mm-hmm.
was getting at, precisely this question, is there a methodology that can be objective in a way that it will give you the truth? You
Yes.
see, because basic assumption is that if your methodology is flawed, there's no way that you will arrive at reliable conclusions on the basis of a flawed methodology. To
Mm-hmm.
get an objective understanding of any text, your methodology has to be sound. And this
Yes.
is a point a number of even contemporary present day ulama, I mean scholars, emphasized. People like Taha Jabir Rawani and Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman in their recent works, Reviving the Balance and Christ in the Muslim Mind and Retrieving the
Mm-hmm.
Quranic book. They both very strongly emphasize that the traditional methodology needs to be reformed. Now, we are not trying to reform Islam. We are trying to reform the methodology and
Yes.
improve our knowledge of Islam, because of course the Quran cannot be corrupted. But what about the knowledge of the Quran? Allah
Mm-hmm.
promised to protect the Quran, but did He promise to protect our knowledge of the text? So this is where the problematic tafsir comes in, and
Mm-hmm.
I believe that yes, the traditional knowledge of of this deen, yes, it needs to be rehabilitated, and the
Mm-hmm.
word corruption is also used, by the way, for what it's worth. Even I mean, in a discussion that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf had with Naqib Alatas, he mentioned this right in front of
Mm-hmm.
him, that yes, we have this problem of the corruption of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So that's where we need to go back to the drawing board, back to square one, reassess our methodology, and then make a fresh
Mm-hmm.
start, and make a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And that also includes, I think, admitting that yes, there were some things that happened that should not have happened in Islamic
Mm-hmm.
history. Many things that happened were excellent and praiseworthy, but not everything was peaches and cream, so to speak. So we should not
Mm-hmm.
try to sweep the. Yes, we recognize that the problems were there, but we are not going to, as it were, disregard them. Like, for example, recently I reread a paper by Umar Chapra, who is a senior consultant to the Saudi Arabia Monetary Authority. He wrote an excellent book on why the Islamic civilization declined. I certainly agree with many of his observations. But in this one paper, Is Rationalism Possible in a Muslim World, he completely disregards the mass slaughter of the philosophers in 786 and
Mm-hmm.
seems to place the whole blame for the Inquisition on the rationalists,
Mm-hmm.
while by his own admission, there were only 4 people that died during the Inquisition by the Mu'tazilites of the traditionists, while when the traditionists had the upper hand some years earlier, there were 5,000 victims of the traditionists. So
Mm-hmm.
the harm that the traditionists did in 786 to the rationalists, and the question remains open: how many of these so-called rationalists were actually members of the Ahlul Kalam? You see,
Mm-hmm.
was this a persecution purely of people who were into science and philosophy and what have you, or were there's evidence that there were some Shias also involved in
Mm-hmm.
this. They were among the victims, but what
Mm-hmm.
about, were there any Ahlul Kalam who were also swept up in this? What do you call it? The communists sometimes have these purges, this purge, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a question that I'm sort of putting on the back burner for the time being. I think I need to look further into it,
Mm-hmm.
and it is, of course, quite fascinating. But I think I do believe, to come back to your question, that yes, objectivity is possible, but objectivity comes in degrees. Some interpretations are more objective than others, and there are ways of differentiating degrees of
Mm-hmm.
objectivity. For example,
Mm-hmm.
Look at Imam al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa. He criticizes philosophers very broadly. I don't recall reading a single quotation from any single philosopher that he was criticizing. Now, is this scholarship that you would consider to be reliable? I wouldn't. If
Mm-hmm.
somebody wants to criticize, say, my views, I want a quotation from you, exactly the words that I said, and then criticize what I said. But he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
do that. Yet he
Mm-hmm.
refers to the people that follow the philosophers as quote unquote imbeciles. That is an
Mm-hmm.
ad hominem attack. Now,
Yeah, ad
when I was
hominem.
reading
Yes,
that,
yes.
yeah,
Okay.
ad
Mm-hmm.
hominem, personal attack. When I was reading that book, I said to myself, if this was, submitted as a PhD dissertation at a reputable university, I don't think it would have made the grade.
I see.
The scholarship there, I consider it to be substandard, quite frankly. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
know why it achieved such prominence. It is a
Mm-hmm.
rant. It's a form of propaganda, if you ask me. But anyway,
Ah,
so
okay.
to come back to the main point, yes, I believe the objectivity is possible. And by the way, we need to remember that Allah Himself gives the best tafsir according to the book
Mm-hmm.
itself. He presents the Quran as the Ahsanul Hadith, and which also contains the Ahsanul Tafsir. So the
Yes,
interpretation done by Allah Himself, it says in Surah 75, Inna alayna bayana, it is on us to explain it. And there's
yes.
even a hadith where one of the
Mm-hmm.
Sahaba said, and I think this is a true hadith. I may not consider it to be part of Islamic law, but I think it's a true hadith, and I don't have any reason to feel that I should reject it. But he said that, I quote, nobody explains better than Allah, end of quote.
Mm-hmm.
So now, who has the audacity to say among the human beings that he or she can explain better than Allah? I would like to know that. But
Mm-hmm.
you see,
Mm-hmm.
traditional Sunni position is that the Prophet came to explain the Quran. Yeah, they misrendered the word tubayna to mean to explain in one of the verses. I think it's 1644. While in fact that word means to sort of make it evident, to present it to people. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that's discussion we can touch on it at some other time. So yes, I do believe objectivity is possible, but the methodology is very important here to reach
Mm-hmm.
that objectivity. Without the proper methodology, a reliable methodology, we are not going
Mm-hmm.
to have any objectivity, and in fact, we may get exactly the reverse: confusion
Mm-hmm.
and a retreat into corruption of knowledge, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes, I see.
Thank you.
So the best we can do then is to try to revise our approach to the Quran
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
admit that it explains itself because it says it does, and then try to seek ways in which we can perceive that understanding, and then discuss this with each other and say, oh, this is what I think Allah is saying, rather than taking a legalist position and saying, this is what Allah says. You say, what? Then you take you might as well be sitting on the papist throne as an infallible interpreter. So um, I'm happy. I'm very pleased, and I'm happy to hear you say many of these things, because I have these suspicions as, again, an outsider, outside the traditionalist approach to understanding Islam, and I'm looking at it and I see all this conflict, I see this chaos, I see the good fruit and the bad fruit, all apparently, ostensibly proceeding from the same source. And this can't possibly be true, because the tree of life does not produce good and bad fruit, you see. So that's the tree of good and evil, and we have to differentiate them one from another. So um, our approach has to be revised so that we sit not in conflict, but in a complementary affirmation of what is already there, and say with each other, well, let's look at it. Let's look at this word. Let's look at this letter. Let's look at this symbol. Let's look at the context. Let's look at the history, and then uh, come together and say, okay, well, that tafsir is evidently wrong. You see, I'm using that as the archetypal approach because we've got to compare and contrast, you see. And so you don't know what's good many times unless you also confront what's evil. And you can think about these things in abstract terms, but if you've got something concrete that's concretely evil or concretely wrong or in error, then you have that and you can use it as a contrast to what you are apparently trying to derive by God's grace, you see. And I use that because I use that term grace because this is the part of one of the attributions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Rahim. You see, this is an additional grace. This is an addition to what He gives us to sustain our life. But what He gives us to sustain our spiritual maturation, if we're not reaching in and taking that grace, if He's not handing it to us because we're not ready to receive it, then we cannot do anything other than proceed in error. And it seems to me that that's what the ulama have done. And so I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses us and others like ourselves and this wonderful writer you mentioned, Shagrul. I'm going to read that chapter this week, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much. So that they can wake up and say, okay, I was wrong. They were wrong. Ghazali was wrong. Someone, of these wonderful, nearly sainted antecedents, they were wrong, operating in error, thinking they had this grace when in fact they didn't have it. They were under the political motivators, which sustains the nafs out of selfishness. And that brings us back to Kabil, you see. So when you gave me that one word answer, politics, well, that's the same answer, isn't it, to many of our problems in this sphere, which is a sphere of trial, to see which of us is the uh, doer of the best deeds. You see, so that's also in the Quran. So let's stop apologizing for misdeeds and become doers of the best deeds. And with that, I'll end, brother, and we'll try and take up these threads again next week, inshallah. Is there anything you would like to add before we close?
No, I think it's pretty much wraps it up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wassalamu alaikum. Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until we next meet, dear brother, and thank you.
And thank you, and walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.